Hi there. We're here for Class 9 for Introduction to Judaism, and this is the beginning of our new unit, Unit 2. We just finished Unit 1. You wrote the test on Tuesday in Class 8. Well done, by the way. The majority of the tests were really quite good, which probably means I need to try to make the next test a little bit more challenging, which is probably exactly what you want to hear, but I will try my best. This is Class 9, the beginning of Week 5. It's also the first class before Reading Week, so Week 5 will spill over Reading Week, and we'll come back with Class 10 after Reading Week on October 19th. There are no lectures posted during Reading Week, so you can take a rest. And Unit 2 moves into the Middle Ages. Middle Ages is often a period that is largely overlooked when people talk about the history of Judaism in sort of a basic or introductory manner. People often will skip from the interesting, active, vibrant, important antiquity or classical period and into the creation of Rabbinic Judaism, and then often you won't hear a lot more until the Enlightenment and the beginning of the denominational split in the modern period. The Middle Ages is really valuable. It's also really interesting. I happen to be a bit of a medieval history buff, so I personally find it very interesting. But it's also incredibly valuable. It's during this period, as the Jews spread out in diaspora, and they spend 1,000 years in different places. This is when Minhag is created, when a lot of the cultural, ethno-religious ways of life are established is through life in the Middle Ages. So a lot of what we would recognize as Judaism today isn't necessarily based in the Bible or in Talmud. It's actually through the generations of people living in these different places. So the Middle Ages is incredibly important. Not always happy. There's lots of instances of tragedy and oppression that we will be talking about in this unit, but it's not all gloom either. There's a lot of really interesting stuff in this unit. So I am Holly, your Dr. Pierce, as you prefer. I have my open office hours for this class on Thursday, so today at 4. You can come by and see me if you want. I will not be holding regular office hours over Reading Week. I find that students just don't use them. But I am available for appointments during Reading Week if you do need to speak to me. Okay, so today for Class 9, we're going to sort of introduce the unit and move into the Middle Ages with a discussion of Jewish diversity. So the Middle Ages is, in many ways, probably the most uniform or cohesive period of Judaism. So we saw in antiquity, with the ancient Israelite religion, and even with early Judaism, there was lots of diversity, lots of do-it-yourself Judaism, lots of competing versions of Judaism, lots of sectarian Judaisms. And in the modern period, we get the advent of sort of the denominational period, and again, a lot of different competing forms of Judaism. In the Middle Ages, we have less of that. Rabbinic Judaism really sort of dominates the landscape, and it comes in different cultural forms, but in many ways, Judaism itself as a religion is surprisingly cohesive during the Middle Ages. So we'll talk about in Class 10, we'll talk about this Jewish uniformity and how that came about. But today is actually one of my favorite classes. It's actually one of my favorite things to talk about. And it's actually the Jewish diversity of the Middle Ages that continue throughout the Middle Ages. Because it is truly remarkable how many different places Judaism established itself, and how those different forms of Judaism and Jewish ways of life and Jews just take on different forms, different permutations throughout the Middle Ages. So while we spend a lot of time talking about Rabbinic Judaism and Jewish uniformity in this unit, I want to start with Jewish diversity so that you won't forget that throughout all of this, Judaism is a really vast tapestry of lots of different threads. And it's truly beautiful. Like, it's truly beautiful to explore sort of all of the different ways Judaism has lived and come to life. Now, at this point in the term, I'm a little bit on the tired side, and I'm sure you probably are too. So I'm going to try to keep today relatively simple. None of this stuff is simple. It's not easy to make this stuff simple. But I'm going to try, I'm going to try hard to just sort of ease us into Unit 2 as best I can. So today you had a reading from an ebook and a PDF reading on women in Judaism. Now, women in Judaism will come up over and over again throughout the term. We will spend an entire week or an entire session, I can't remember now, on women in Judaism in the modern period. But do remember that women are a thing throughout the Middle Ages. Okay, that sounds kind of ridiculous, but sometimes when you study Judaism, it can be hard to remember that, like, there were ladies involved in all this stuff, because Judaism, like many religions, focuses a lot on the male perspective and male expectations and experiences. So it's good to get that out of the way right now. Remember that women are active throughout all of this, and in many ways the Middle Ages is a really rich time for women's Judaism, and but unfortunately we don't have as much evidence about that as we would like, but I want to keep talking about that throughout. Your primary text reading for today is kind of different. It's a website and not a text. So just explore it and get a sense of Jewish diversity that you can find through there. Okay, so this is Introduction to Judaism, RE204. And we just finished Unit 1, the Antiquity section. And in that section, we get a lot of the concepts established, we get a lot of the formative history underway, and we moved into the creation of Rabbinic Judaism, which is sort of technically moving in to the Middle Ages period. Often when we're talking about the Middle Ages, we're talking about around the 4th century till about the 14th or 15th century when the Enlightenment starts to occur. But don't worry, we'll talk about the Enlightenment in Unit 3. And in Unit 3, we will be looking at modernity and post-modernity. Now, I'm going to fudge a little bit with this unit by moving into sort of pre-modernity, or some of the things will overlap. But human history is not easy to divide up cleanly, so decisions had to be made, and there you have it. So we will be focusing on the 4th century to the 15th century, which overlaps with this age of definition that we already started to talk about in Unit 1. Jacob Neusner, who was an incredibly influential figure in Jewish studies, calls the period from 70 CE, which, what happened in 70 CE? Very good. The fall of the temple. I heard you yell it out to me. So 70 CE to 650 CE, he calls this the Age of Definition because this is where the core sacred texts of Rabbinic Judaism, the core practices to some extent, and certainly the core process of Rabbinic Judaism is solidified during that period. And it's an incredibly active period. It's an incredibly important one. We already talked a little bit about the creation of the Mishnah and the Talmud, but these things firm up through this period. The sort of the final forms of these things start to take shape. The Masoretic text, and particularly the Talmud, take shape in this form. So we carry this stuff on from Unit 1 into the Middle Ages. And you can see that there's overlap if we're going to be talking about the 4th century to the 14th or 15th century. There's some overlap here because Rabbinic Judaism wasn't like immediately concretized in a year or two after the fall of the temple. So it's a long period of Judaism, Rabbinic Judaism being defined and refined and becomes dominant throughout the known Jewish world, I guess, if you want to put it that way, after the loss of the temple. So it's not like all Jews became rabbinic Jews overnight, but there is a process of rabbinic Judaism becoming dominant. And again, like we saw in Unit 1, not all Jews became rabbinic Jews. And so we'll also talk a little bit again about non-rabbinic Judaism today, because I think that people need to be reminded that rabbinic Judaism is not synonymous with Judaism as a whole. So in this unit, we're going to do some intro stuff for week 5, so Judaism in the Middle Ages and its diversity and its uniformity, and why that uniformity happened, how rabbinic Judaism became dominant. We're going to also, in class 10, we're going to watch a film that can highlight for you how uniformity and diversity work together. So even as Judaism sort of expressed their own contexts, they kept certain strains of commonality. It's really important to understand the complexity and beauty and the diversity and the variety, as well as shared concepts and shared concerns and shared imagination that also goes with that, and really understand the interesting relationship between diversity and uniformity. Okay, so in week 6, we're going to look specifically at Jews in the modern world, or Jews in the Christian world, sorry. So, Christianity effectively becomes the state religion in the 4th century. So it goes from being a sect of Judaism to its own religion, and then moves into being the religion in power. So what started out as a sectarian dispute and becomes sort of polemics between competing religions becomes, in the medieval Christian world, a problem for Jews, essentially. Jews living in the Christian world did not fare entirely well throughout the medieval period. And there's going to be some distressing history that we're going to have to address there. In week 7, we're going to look at Jews in the medieval world, or in the medieval Muslim world. Jews fared much better under Islam than they did under Christianity. Christians, or Jews and Muslims, tended to get along better. They saw each other in each other, they dressed similarly, they practiced similarly. There was less of a distinction between Muslims and Jews than there was between Christians and Jews in Europe, particularly. And in the medieval Muslim world, we have instances of tragedy and we have instances of oppression, but overall, the medieval Islamic world was actually a really good one for the Jews. And we have, in the Islamic world, moments where we can actually consider sort of the golden age of Jewish culture in the Middle Ages. Both of these, as Christianity became the state religion in the 4th century, and as Islam came on the scene in a big way in the 7th century, this sets the tone effectively for the Jewish Middle Ages. They are living under one or the other of these religions for the most part. So living in exile amongst others that they sort of have to learn to live under, because Islam and Christianity had a really good run at both being dominant religions, and Judaism doesn't in the Middle Ages. So when we're talking about the Jewish Middle Ages, we're talking about a Judaism that learns to live under other religions, and this marks Judaism quite significantly. Most importantly, this is the period when Judaism starts to discourage conversion, because it was actually illegal for them to seek converts. So we have a tradition within Judaism before this period of Judaism may actually have been a missionary religion. It may actually have sought converts. But during the Middle Ages, Judaism becomes a non-conversionary religion, to the point where rabbis are, within Rabbinic Judaism, rabbis are encouraged to turn down people who seek conversion at least 3 times and then allow them after that if they persist. This isn't just theological, this is also pragmatic. Jewish communities could be harmed if they were perceived as being a threat religiously. So Judaism becomes a closed religion, essentially, during the Middle Ages, and it's because of its historical context that this happens. And then in week 8, I will fudge a little and go to pre-modernity. These movements could have been covered in early modernity, but I feel that they have more in common with the medieval period than with the modern period. So after 1,000 years of living under Christianity, particularly, and Islam, there is a sort of exhaustion that comes at the end of the Middle Ages. So we have movements like Kabbalah and Hasidic Judaism that comes at the end of that 1,000 years that are revival movements, for the most part, that seek to sort of reverse the Jewish exhaustion after the Middle Ages, particularly in Europe. So we're going to be covering the origins of the Hasidic movement and Kabbalah in week 8, just before the test. They could have possibly been moved into early modern, but Hasidic Jews aren't, as a movement, is not the same as, the Reform Orthodox split that we see under the denominational stuff in Unit 3. So I chose to keep them in Unit 2. So that's what we'll be doing this unit. I hope you find this as interesting, possibly even more interesting than Unit 1. Unit 1, we had to cover like 2,000 years, 3,000 years in a couple of weeks. This time we will actually sort of have a little bit of time to slow down and reflect. But we still have to kind of go at a breakneck speed. We still only have 4 weeks to cover 1,000 years. And that's still a lot, but we're up for it. Have coffee, we'll travel. Okay, so now into the Middle Ages, Judaism is marked by primarily Rabbinic Judaism. Rabbinic Judaism becomes dominant in this period. The Jewish Middle Ages are marked by a state of diaspora or exile. It's often dotted with events of persecution and expulsions, so a lot of mobility, but not always voluntary mobility, and a good sense of isolation or alienation, oftentimes actually with real ghettos, and we will talk about the medieval ghettos, this unit. And of course, the advent of anti-Semitism. So anti-Semitism, like anything, has a history. It's not just, it hasn't always been. When we looked at the Greeks and the Romans, what we really were kind of looking at was anti-Judaism, not anti-Semitism. So there's a difference between disliking a religion and being prejudiced, almost racist, against a people attached to that religion. Under the Greeks and Romans, we have anti-Judaism, a dislike of Judaism, or more appropriately, sort of an inability to understand Judaism. And in the Middle Ages, we get the development of actual anti-Semitism, the kind that we would recognize today, the kind that then sort of becomes a pseudo-racial, like a racial pseudoscience that eventually leads to the Holocaust. Those roots are in the Middle Ages, so we will explore those a bit. Judaism in the Middle Ages is also marked by continued religious and theological productivity. So there is gloom, but there is also a lot of creativity, a lot of life in the Jewish Middle Ages. And of course, at the end of the Middle Ages into the pre-modern, the advent of printing presses and mass communications that really affect Judaism. Because remember, in these early days in the Middle Ages, all texts are still written by hand. So that definitely affects texts and their relationship to the Jews. When you can start printing them, start making them available to people, when you can start printing newspapers, this changes the Jewish landscape quite a bit. You move from handwritten letters and proclamations and handwritten texts, handwritten Bibles, and handwritten Talmuds, which is not an easy feat, to mechanically printed ones. This changes people and their relationship to sacred texts and to community information. And remember, throughout the Middle Ages, Judaism coexists alongside with its two main colleague religions, the other Abrahamic religions, Christianity and Islam. And Judaism is shaped through this coexistence. A lot of the coexistence is traumatic, but Jews often lived in isolation, but Judaism did not function in isolation from these two religions. So we have Judaism that absorbs things from Christianity and Islam. We have Judaism that adapts to resist assimilation into Christianity and Islam. And we have Judaism that develops out of a dialogue with Judaism and Islam, or Christianity and Islam. So this is a period of intense encounter, and it is a period of intense productivity. Anti-Semitism, by the way, in case this is a new word for you, is the irrational hatred of the Jews as a people and the resulting mistreatment of that people. Okay, so anti-Semitism is a form of hate. It's a prejudice. It's a form of hate. Okay, so the age of cogency is what Neusner calls the period from the 600s to the 1800s, in which Judaism takes mostly one form, Rabbinic Judaism, although we will also explore examples of non-Rabbinic Judaism, and already have looked at non-Rabbinic or non-Talmudic Judaism. We'll look a bit more today and off and on throughout the term. But Neusner calls this period the age of cogency because it is relatively uniform, it's relatively stable, it's relatively unified under the rabbis. But we can't give in to the idea of normative Judaism even in the Middle Ages. So there are elements of truth to the fallacy of normative Judaism, so the age of cogency. There is truth to the idea that Judaism was fairly uniform in the Middle Ages. We looked at sort of common Judaism, and we will look at common threads that were shared amongst Judaism. So there are elements of truth to the idea of normative Judaism. But Rabbinic Judaism is not Judaism. It's not equated, it's not synonymous with just Judaism. Rabbinic Judaism is dominant, but it is not the only normal Judaism. Don't ever confuse dominance with normalcy, okay? That's one of the things that we as a society do wrong all the time. We assume that which is in power is somehow normal and everything else is abnormal. A lot of the things that we get wrong as a society is rooted in that fallacy. So don't apply that here. So normative Judaism, or the fallacy of normative Judaism, is the assumption that there is a norm of Judaism, of mainstream Judaism, usually Rabbinic Judaism, that becomes sort of real Judaism, and everything else is fake or abnormal or simply invisible. We simply just don't talk about it at all. And I get that there is a certain allure to the normative. It's easier to study, it's easier to explain Judaism if you stick to one version of it, and choices have to be made, and if you only have 12 weeks, it makes sense to talk most about the dominant forms, but there's danger in the fallacy of normative Judaism. In many ways, we're better off talking about Judaisms plural, because there are always multiple different varieties of Judaism going at any different time. And of course, as we looked at in Unit 1, this includes non-Talmudic Judaism. So non-Talmudic Judaism are those forms of Judaism which do not hold the Talmud or the oral law sacred. So they usually have just Torah, Tanakh, or the Bible only, and they don't accept the Mishnah and the resulting Talmud as being sacred books. And Rabbinic Judaism does. Talmudic Judaism is right what it says on the can. It's Judaism stemming from the Talmud. And Talmudic Judaism and Rabbinic Judaism is largely the same thing, because Rabbinic Judaism holds Talmud sacred. Non-Talmudic Judaism or non-Rabbinic Judaism still exist today, despite the difficulties in doing so. There is some amount of friction between Rabbinic Judaism, or the Rabbinic Judaism's mainstream, and the continuing existence of Jews that don't accept Talmud. And one of the large examples of that is, of course, Israel. It's quite difficult for non-Talmudic Jews to have voice in Israel. And as we saw with Beta Israel, the Ethiopian Jews, they were actually made to convert to Rabbinic Judaism in order to access Israel. So again, dominance and hegemony does not necessarily mean normal, and having that feeling can oftentimes cause a lot of troubles for people who are considered to be abnormal or somehow less authentic. So there are multiple examples of small local Jewish cultures throughout global Israel, and that's what we're going to be talking about today, global Israel, the Israel of the world, that do or did not conform to Rabbinic or Talmudic Judaism, either partially or fully, depending on the time of dispersion. So some groups just went into diaspora before the Talmud was even a thing, and that's why they didn't have Talmud, like Beta Israel. Beta Israel as a community predates Rabbinic Judaism, so they did their own thing. Others, like the Karaites, which we'll be talking about today, were aware of Talmud. They simply rejected it. Talmudic Jews have often in the past rejected non-Talmudic Jews, or even tried to convert them, or practiced outreach to non-Talmudic Jews, which can be irksome if you already consider yourself a Jew and a Jew is trying to convert you to Judaism. You can see how that would be quite a problem for you. Rabbinic Judaism holds the hegemony, so it holds the position of being the dominant one and being the normal one, and thus it's kind of difficult for non-Rabbinic Jews to get recognized as Jews. Karaite Judaism is probably the oldest, most famous. It's not the oldest. Beta Israel is older, but as a subsect of Judaism, it's probably the longest recognized, let's put it that way, as a form of non-Talmudic Judaism. So Karaism is sort of an ancient sect of Judaism. It's very old. Some say dating from the Second Temple, but it's sort of official beginning in 760. So moving into, we already talked about Karaite Judaism in Unit 1, but in a way it is as well an innovation of the Middle Ages. So in the 8th century, in 760 roundabout, the Babylonian exilarch, which is like sort of the leader of the Babylonian Jewish exile, he died, and two brothers were his most obvious successors. There was Anan ben David and his brother Hananiah. And there was a struggle for succession. The Rabbinic Council of Babylon chose Hananiah as the successor, as the exilarch, and Anan was disinherited as the exilarch. That origin is slightly disputed. There are people who suggest there's not enough evidence to suggest this struggle for succession, but that's sort of the historical way that people start this story, so I'm going to run with it. It's probable that many of Anan's supporters declared him exilarch anyway, so it is possible that there were two exilarchs or two leaders of the exile competing at the same time. Now, the way the exilarch office worked is a person stood for succession, the Rabbinic Council ratified them, and then it would go to the caliphate. At this point, the caliphate because it was an Islamic rule. And then the caliphate would essentially sign off on the rabbi's decision. Like, okay, you've chosen this person, that's cool with me. Unless there was a specific reason to reject it, the caliphate usually accepted it. So Hananiah was chosen by the rabbinic council, and the caliphate ratified Hananiah and not Anan as the exilarch. But it's possible that Anan's supporters at the time declared him exilarch anyway, which went against the caliphate's will, the word that had already gone out from the caliphate. And it's probable that Anan was actually imprisoned for treason, for trying to start a rebellion with his followers. He may have had a very substantial amount of followers. Typically, the caliphates were not terribly concerned about small malcontents with small groups of followers. So he must have had substantial followers. So anyway, he ends up being put in prison. Also partially because he declared his religion different to Judaism, or he was preaching a form of Judaism that was inconsistent with rabbinic Judaism. And the caliphate had given official people of the book protected status to rabbinic Jews, but did not appreciate new forms of Judaism cropping up. So he did a lot of things that ended him up in prison. And he ended up declaring a different religion altogether to avoid being called a heretic. So this is where we get the Ananites, Ananism. He started Ananism so he wouldn't be declared a heretic Jew. He would just declare himself a new religion. And in 770, he published his book, the Book of Precepts, which really sort of kicks off the beginning of the Karaite religion. So Karaite is from the Hebrew meaning readers, so readers of scriptures. They do not hold Talmud or Mishnah as sacred. They hold only Torah and the Bible, and they consider themselves sort of Torah true Jews. So they focus only on Torah and nothing that was, in their eyes, added to Torah through rabbinic activities. And as their proof, they look to Deuteronomy 4, 1-2. So in Torah says, "Now Israel, hear the decrees and laws I am about to teach you. Follow them so that you may live and may go in and take possession of the land of the Lord, the God of your ancestors, is giving you. Do not add to what I command you, and do not subtract from it, but keep the commands of the Lord your God that I give you." So for Karaites, looking at that, they say, well, look, God says right here that we're not to add or subtract from the law. Torah is Torah, and we can't add to that through a lot of fancy rabbinic shenanigans. And they say that because Moses or God never once mentioned oral Torah, that there's no proof that oral Torah is real or that it's sacred, so they stick to the written Torah because that's the only Torah that is mentioned in Torah. So to give an example of how this works, so in Exodus 23:19, the rule is a mitzvah is given: do not sieve a mother in its own, or do not sieve a calf in its own mother's milk. So don't kill a calf and then boil the meat of that calf in its own mother's milk. This has quite famously in Rabbinic Judaism turned into a prohibition against eating milk and meat at the same time, building a fence around the law, which the Pharisees did a lot, saying, well, if we don't eat meat and milk together at all, then we never run the risk of eating the meat of the calf with its own mother's milk. For Karaite Jews, they look at that and say, well, no, the law literally says don't boil a calf in its own mother's milk. That's it. So let's literally not do that. I won't kill a calf and then take its mother's milk and boil it, because that's what the law says. So for Rabbinic Jews to add the prohibition against mixing meat and milk is an addition and is strictly prohibited from Deuteronomy 4, by Deuteronomy 4. So there's lots of little examples that way in which Karaites disagree with Rabbinic Judaism's decision to expand a law or to build a fence around the law or to read into the law things that aren't literally in the text. So while Rabbinic Jews recognize Karaite Jews as Jews, Rabbinic Judaism traditionally forbids the intermarriage between Rabbinic Jews and Karaite Jews because to a Rabbinic Jew, Karaite Jews are simply not following the law according to how they see the law. So they're not considered halakhically part of the community enough to allow for intermarriage. So yes, they might not sieve a calf in its own mother's milk, but they're still eating milk and meat together, which for Rabbinic Jews is unkosher and it's treif and you shouldn't do it. So there is historically a respectful distance, I guess you could put it, kept between Karaite Jews and Rabbinic Jews. This only applies, by the way, to people who are born Karaite Jews. For most of Rabbinic Judaism does not recognize people who convert to Karaite Judaism as being Jews. Within Rabbinic Judaism, only people who convert according to a proper authority can be recognized as Jews after their conversion. So we have here an early split, a very old split, a split that for many Rabbinic Jews particularly means that they cannot intermingle freely. Even though they're recognized as Jews, they're still outside the community because they keep the laws differently. But this is bound to happen. The temple being gone in 70 CE, the great diaspora happening after the fall of the Bar Kokhba revolt, Jews spread out everywhere. They obviously spread throughout the Greco-Roman world because many of them were Roman citizens, so they did stay within the Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire was pretty vast. So we have Jews moving up north into Europe, and certainly down into Africa and certainly into Asia, following trade routes for the most part, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes involuntarily. So global Israel, which kind of started with the Babylonian exile, since many Jews chose not to return from Babylon and way back in the day, and certainly fired by 70 CE and 135 CE, the Jews become a global community at this point. So you can see here by 1200, they're all over, into England, into Dublin has like 1,000-year-old Jewish community. So they've gone the world over at this point. So obviously there's going to be differences. So the Jewish diaspora starts with the exiles, continues after the Roman Wars into Africa, Europe, and Asia, the sort of known world at that time. So a few stats. So these are not dribbles of people. In Babylonia, during the formative period, there's 2 million Jews, and thank goodness for that strong Babylonian community. They took in refugees from the revolts, and they supplied money and texts and leadership. So that Babylonian community might have chosen to stay in exile, but if they hadn't, Judaism may not have survived, frankly. In 1290, in the UK, there was about 16,000. In Germany, Russia, Poland, Hungary, these are nation borders as we know them today don't really exist in the Middle Ages, so we're clumping a lot of these together, but there's 1 million Jews in what we would consider to be Central and Eastern Europe in the Middle Ages. In Spain, in 1492, there's about 200,000. In Arabia, that's all we have from the records, in 1107 is 100,000. In Persia and in India at 1107, another 100,000. In Egypt, in 1160, there were about 5,000. And in China, we have unknown numbers, but we know that there were several settlements in the 6th century, and settlements would suggest at least like 10 to 20 families at least. A minyan at this point required a certain amount of men, so we would consider that there would have to be a certain amount of families in order to constitute a Jewish settlement. So this is both voluntary movement, trade, migration, seeking new opportunities, and involuntary movement like expulsions and persecutions, where the Jews disperse, they keep moving, they're a very mobile population, sometimes against their will, and the populations are really quite fluid, so it is hard to pin down numbers. That's why we have sort of a scatter shot of snapshots where we actually had numbers. But even despite this fluidity, the Jewish communities remained connected in many ways, that the academies remained connected to Jewish settlements throughout the world via letter, which is a very slow process of keeping in touch, but still they managed. People traveled, people went on pilgrimages, people visited each other to some extent. Now, this is different in Europe, because in Europe, Jews were prohibited from traveling in many places. But under Islam, Jews were free to travel pretty much everywhere within the Islamic world. So this is variable, so you'll get some Jews who are more isolated than others, but generally speaking, we can't assume that the Middle Ages was a time where Jews didn't have contact with other Jewish communities. They did manage, for the most part, largely through letters. But we're also really looking at a period of multiple diasporas, sort of what we call layered diasporas. So like, say you were born in India and spent your childhood in the UK and then moved to Toronto when you were 16. That would be a layered diaspora, right? So you have sort of the culture of India, your family culture of living in the UK, and then your family culture of living in Canada. We call that a layered diaspora. Almost nobody these days goes straight from homeland to new land and has no movement. The majority of Jewish families actually have multiple layers of diaspora. So you have the original diaspora, the exile from Jerusalem, and into, for example, Germany in the Middle Ages, and then moving again to Poland, and then moving again to the US or to Israel or to the UK or to Canada. So Jews have multiple layers, and throughout the Middle Ages, sometimes there were multiple layers. So we get some really interesting patterns happening from the multiple migrations. So like Jews exiled from the Holy Land into northern Africa, then they move into Spain, and then in 1492, the Jews are expelled from Spain, which, by the way, is how we know in 1492 there were 200,000 Jews who, after 1492, were no longer in Spain. Oftentimes, that's how we get this number. Here in the UK, 1290, there was an expulsion of 16,000 Jews. That's how we got that number. So these numbers are not necessarily happy numbers. Yeah, here, the expulsion in 1290. The interesting thing there, and we will look more at the expulsions as we move on, these were not always religiously motivated, right? In 1492, Jews were expelled from Spain because they were considered to be allies of the Muslims. And once Spain reconquered Spain, once Spanish Catholics reconquered all of Spain from the Muslims, they expelled the Jews. So it's religiously motivated. Christians had a lot of issues with Jews, and we'll deconstruct that when we look in week 6. But it's also politically motivated. In 1290, the Jews were expelled from the UK. Again, it's religiously motivated. The Christians of 1290 in the UK had a problem with Jews religiously, but also because in the UK, Jews, one of the only jobs Jews could have in the UK at the time was money lending. And in 1290, the crown owed too much money to Jewish bankers, and the Jews were expelled so the crown wouldn't have to pay that back. So these expulsions are never entirely theological. There's often some very pragmatic reasons behind it as well. So medieval movement is sometimes voluntary, sometimes for the best, and sometimes involuntary. Forced movement, forced expulsion, especially due to anti-Semitism, is incredibly traumatic on a people. There's chaos, there's loss of property, loss of money, loss of life. People in systems or in situations of expulsion, refugees effectively, are highly vulnerable to disease and malnutrition and violence. So these expulsions were incredibly traumatic. We lost lives throughout these expulsions. We lost a lot throughout these expulsions. Families were disrupted, uprooted, oftentimes disconnected. People were lost. People died. So expulsions are probably one of the most violent forms of oppression that we see in the Middle Ages. And it's rooted in, particularly in Christian Europe, it's rooted in this idea that Jews aren't real citizens. They're there on the tolerance of the crown and can simply lose their permission to live in a place whenever the crown or the kingdom wants to do that. And these experiences mark Judaism and Jewish culture pretty gravely. On one hand, theologically, it seems to reinforce the idea of exile being a punishment. But on the other hand, Judaism has to respond by cultivating extreme resilience during this period. And this is expressed theologically in many ways throughout the Middle Ages. And we'll look not just at the history of Jews in the Middle Ages, but we'll also look at theological developments in the Middle Ages, because as we've looked at before, the history of the Jews is the story of Judaism, and theological adaptations cannot be studied without looking at the history, and vice versa. So the Jewish diaspora in the Middle Ages is not necessarily a happy story. And I do warn you that there will be lectures and snippets in these lectures over the next few weeks that will not be easy for you to hear, and they're not going to be easy for me to talk about. But this is our history, and we can't flinch from it. So do be warned. Do take the care of yourself that you need. If you need to pause a video and go walk your dog or go have a cup of tea, do that, because this stuff is not, at times this will not be for the faint of heart, I guess. And it's only a class. There's no reason to put yourself through torture and stick it out if pausing the video and going to get a drink of water will help you get through it. Okay, so having said that, there's really very, very few people in places in Europe that has never experienced an expulsion. It's almost like a rite of passage for Europe. Now, you will notice that there are also patterns to this. Again, these expulsions were not always religiously motivated or purely religiously motivated. A lot of these actually match up with other things going on in Europe, particularly plagues. Jews were often expelled surrounding plague scares and that kind of thing, which in many cases, I can't help but think, probably did not do the plague situation any good. If you're expelling large numbers of people and sending them wandering as refugees throughout your continent during a time of plague, that just spreads more plague. It just makes more vulnerable people, more hungry, malnourished people to fall victim to these things. But this is, the Middle Ages were often quite brutal. And they did not necessarily bring out the best in people. Not always the worst. There are elements of excellence that we will look at, but the Middle Ages did not generally bring out the best in people. Okay, so the diaspora is complicated, it's multi-layered, and it contains voluntary and involuntary movement, but we get sort of the rise of these major cultural, regional cultural groups, what we kind of call the Kulturbereich, the cultural regions. Cultural Bereich is sort of a fancy term for cultural region. And here we have, entering into the stage, the creation of a couple of the big cultural groups that remain with us today. And when you look at Judaism, oftentimes what you're seeing is the Judaism flavored by these regional cultural groups. We have the Ashkenazi through Europe and into Russia. We have the Sephardim, or the Sephardic Jews of northern Africa and Spain. So Sephardic Jews are from the Muslim world generally, and Ashkenazi Jews evolved as cultural groups within the Christian world largely, and the Mizrahi, or the Eastern Jews. And for the most part also under Islam, but in a different fashion. We'll look at that. Oftentimes, overlooked, the Mizrahi. Oftentimes we only really talk about the Ashkenazi and the Sephardim because they tend to be the wealthier or the more visible Jews. The Mizrahi group continues to be a really vibrant cultural group, and one that is often not treated very well in many respects. So we'll look more at that. And then we have a series of sort of independent groupings, and which you hopefully you find, ooh, that perks up your ears. Who are these independent groupings? Because all things in scholarship is not as neat and tidy as we would like it. So we can say the Ashkenazi and the Mizrahi and the Sephardim, but there's always going to be groups that outlie that. And there's lots of diversity within even Ashkenazi, Sephardim, and Mizrahi. There's lots of diversity going on here. So the Ashkenazi, originally pertaining to German Jews, the Ashkenaz, sort of the Central Europe, now largely referring to all Jews of European ethnic rights and traditions. So Germany, largely France and Germany originally, but Central Europe and, of course, Eastern Europe, where many of our families ended up after they were expelled from Central Europe. So we often associate Ashkenazi with Eastern European Jews, but that's not where they began. This is why Yiddish, the primary traditional language of the Ashkenazi, other than Hebrew, of course, all of these Jews keep Hebrew as important. But the common lingua franca of the Ashkenazi was Yiddish, and this is medieval German effectively spelled in Hebrew script. Sorry, I've got cat hairs hanging off my glasses, and it's driving me nuts. Sorry. And that's why Ashkenazi's language is Yiddish in Hebrew form and not Polish in Hebrew form, is that the Ashkenazi start in Central Europe in medieval Germany and then eventually move to Poland. And we'll talk about that move and how that happens when we look at the Ashkenazi effectively in week 6. The Sephardim, they also have their own lingua franca. They obviously keep Hebrew, and keep Hebrew in a much more sophisticated way in many ways than the Ashkenazi. The Sephardim are also still creating poems and literature in Hebrew at a different rate than the Ashkenazi. The Ashkenazi use Hebrew liturgically and academically, but the Sephardim are also using Hebrew artistically throughout this period, which is quite interesting. But many Sephardim spoke Ladino, which is a melding of Hebrew and Aramaic, or sort of Aramaic in Hebrew letters. And they originate specifically in Spain, which was called Sepharad, and that's where the name comes from. Often the word Sephardim, although it originates in Spain, it really kind of has come to mean most Jews that come out of an Islamic context. Although in North Africa, a lot of the term Maghrebi is often used for North African Jews because again, expulsions and so forth. When the Sephardim are expelled in 1492, many of them move into North Africa, but there were already Jews living in North Africa, and there were cultural differences there. So again, these culture baraiks are not as simple as they might appear on that little map. And Mizrahi generally means Eastern Jews, specifically describing Jews of the Middle East and sometimes into the more Asian-wise, depending on their tradition, on their rites, on their languages. And of course, connected to this are Sabra, and those are Jews who developed within Israel. But there are lots of blurred divisions. Obviously now there are Jews of Ashkenazi and Sephardic traditions and Mizrahi traditions all living in Israel. So the old tradition of calling Jews born in Israel Sabra is a bit blurred. The Jews of Beta Israel, who are African Jews from Ethiopia, non-Talmudic Jews. Now many of them live in Israel and are now rabbinic Jews because they've converted. So again, there's lots of blurred divisions going on here. The Jews of Amsterdam, for example, who are originally Sephardic, but at the time of expulsion they moved to the Netherlands and remain Sephardic, but separate it from other Sephardic groups. So they also change and evolve over time. So the Jews of Amsterdam generally in many ways become sort of their own little offshoot of Sephardic culture, the Sephardic culture of the Netherlands. And then this is also made complex by the fact that it is the Jews of Amsterdam that get itchy feet and end up moving to Brazil and to the Americas and so forth. The first Jews in North America were Sephardic Jews who had been expelled from Spain and ended up in Amsterdam and in the UK and eventually ended up in the Americas. And there are specific reasons why the Sephardic Jews were the first ones to migrate to the Americas, but we'll look at that in a few weeks. The Italkim, these are the Jews of Italy, and they consider themselves a distinct culture baraikt because they predate Ashkenazi, so many people would assume they are part of the Ashkenazi because they're European, but they are actually really old. They started there under the Roman Empire. So they consider themselves culturally distinct from the Ashkenazi. And the Romaniotes, who you might consider to be, you might think that's from Rome or Romania or one of the Romance areas, but it is not actually. That's the Jews of Greece, who likewise settled in Greece during the Greco-Roman periods and is a very, very old community. So they also consider themselves to be distinct from the other culture baraiks. So they're European, but they're not Ashkenazi, and they're not Sephardic either. So they are Romaniotes. And now, of course, with mobility, with intermarriage, okay, and I tried to keep this simple, but Ashkenazi Jews and Sephardic Jews and Mizrahi Jews are still all Jews. All of these people are still Jews. They recognize each other as Jews. They have a shared Jewishness. They have shared commonalities. Many of them are rabbinic Jews, so they share religions in common. But for a really long time, Ashkenazi families didn't want their kids marrying Sephardic Jews and vice versa, and we'll look a little bit as to why. So you could recognize them as Jews, but it was problematic or awkward in some ways to blend as families. This is different now. I don't know of many families that are too concerned about whether or not their kids marry. I don't know of too many Ashkenazi families that care whether their kid is marrying an Ashkenazi Jew or a Sephardic Jew or whatever. Individual families might be racist, so they might have problems with marrying Jews of color. Unfortunately, Jews and Judaism is not free of the illness of racism, so that exists. But on a religious, on the religious plane, most families don't really care about intermarriage between these cultural groups. They're now recognized more as just cultural groups rather than distinctions. So now you get these wonderful permutations like Ashkephardic, which is someone who comes from a tradition. One side of the family is Ashkenazi and the other side of the family is Sephardim. And this really does color their Judaism because they're taking elements, cultural elements from both. So Ashkephardic is a newer cultural group and a rising one as we all meld in our different locations. I think to some extent I could claim that a little bit, but anyway. I'm Ashkenazi. That is my primary designation. Okay, so Jewish settlements in the Shum is where the Ashkenazi cultural Bereicht comes from, and the Shum, S-H-U-M, usually all capital letters. Don't worry about it. We'll look at the Shum a lot more. Refers to this little cluster here of towns, the Shum cities, Speyer, Worms, and Mainz, or Spira, Vermesa, and Magenza. In the 10th century, these were some of the most powerful, most populous, most happy and healthy Jewish settlements in Europe. They were invited there by the bishops of these places to settle, to do business, to start trades, to add to the life of the town. And for a really long time, they do really well there. Like, there's no great love fest between them and their Christian neighbors, but not a major problem. They were there by invitation, and there was a certain protection for them there. In the 10th century, the 11th century, this changes. In 1096, the First Crusade happens, and there is essentially in Mainz there is a massacre that I believe could be designated as ethnic cleansing. The Crusades fired up religious fervor against the enemies of Christ, and the Jews were labeled as enemies of Christ. And we get a lot of movement from the original Shum cities, the roots of the Ashkenazi culture Bereicht, into other parts of Europe, particularly into Poland. And we'll look at why so many of the Jews from here moved into Poland. Now, this map is from 1200. There are still Jews living in these areas, but life for them is vastly different after 1096. Many Jews end up, well, if they survived, they ended up moving. And again, we have Sephardic Jews living around the world, starting from particularly the expulsion of 1496. And you can see that the Sephardic Jews settled in the UK, they settled in Amsterdam, they settled in Paris, they settled all throughout Italy, they settled throughout northern Africa and into the Middle East and into Asia Minor and into Greece and the Balkans, all around the Mediterranean essentially, and also to the Americas. And this is actually one of the places where many of us, if we had to pick a European or like the most recent home for our families, many of us would actually point to the Pale of Settlement. And this is a strip of land basically between Poland and Russia, where a lot of Ashkenazi Judaism flourished. Until it didn't. So it is a place of freedom, and it's a place of cultural creation, and for many families it became a place of oppression. This is the story of the Jewish Middle Ages. There's flourishing, there's people doing what they have to do to survive, and sometimes there's people thriving, and then there comes a time when you have to leave, where things get bad and it's time to go. And this is the way the Jewish Middle Ages go. We will talk about the Pale of Settlement a bit more and how it became the Pale of Settlement. It's called the Pale of Settlement because at a certain point, this was the only place in Eastern Europe where Jews were allowed to live. So they were like, it is a region that is also in some sense a ghetto. Okay, so the Jews of Asia and Africa. Now, this is a really interesting story, and one that unfortunately I actually learned nothing about during my undergraduate. I came upon these just by reading. I didn't learn much at all about the Jews of Africa and Asia, and I wish I had. So hence this slide. The Jews of Africa is very old communities, like First Temple old. In many cases. So we have Northern Africa, the Berber Jews, for example. We have East Africa, so Beta Israel, who trace the Ethiopian Jews who trace their roots to the Solomonic period. West Africa, the people who sort of identify themselves as Igbo Jews. These are Nigerian biblical Jews, so-called, Torah only. And the Lemda of Southern Africa in Zimbabwe, has an oral tradition of Jewish descent. So we know that many Jewish groups traveled very broadly throughout Africa, of course to Egypt, because that was a major center of Jewish life for a really long time, but throughout Africa entire, including sub-Saharan Africa. The Jews of Asia, very old communities as well, but not all of them originate at the same time. So you have Bene Israel and the Koshin Jews. These are old Indian communities of Jews, but then you have the Paradisi Jews, who are Jews from Portugal who end up settling in India because Portugal had a colony in India. So they're Jews from India, but they're also considered Portuguese Jews, and there has historically been some disconnect between the Indian Jewish communities and the Portuguese Indian communities. So it's complicated. And the Kaifeng Jews of China, which is one of my favorite groups that moved with the Silk Road very early on. And we'll look more at the Kaifeng Jews in a moment. So the regional groupings start looking a lot more complicated than the original map here. It's actually, there is gradients here. So the Kaifeng Synagogue of 1722 is a building that we actually have a great deal of documentation for. We have diagrams of, and here's a model of it. But the Kaifeng Jews did not start in 1792, not at 1722, hardly. They actually started in about 1600 to 1000 CE. They came via the Silk Road, probably via Persia. And they were largely ethnic Chinese and Jewish. So they were Jews who adapted and absorbed the local Chinese culture. And as you can see, the way their synagogue looked, it reflects the Chinese culture in combination with Jewish culture, because the synagogue also was constructed to sort of mirror the temple in Jerusalem. And it was called the Temple of Purity and Goodness, which I think is lovely because it is so quintessentially Chinese, but in a way that's recognizable within Judaism. It was originally built in 1163, and we don't really know what the original synagogue looked like. It was rebuilt in 1763 and again in 1722, and this is the 1722 is the synagogue that we know what it looked like. And it was unfortunately destroyed in 1852, possibly through mudslides, through natural disaster, and the community seems to have faded. They either moved on or they just were absorbed by the local community. They were highly acculturated to Chinese life. They had taken on Chinese dress and Chinese language, obviously, but they maintained distinct Jewish practice and identity for 800 years. So this is pretty extraordinary. So the synagogue was, for this community, what we call a complete institution, or a total institution. So it had a mikveh. Don't worry, we'll talk about mikvahs more. It had a kosher butcher shop. It had a kitchen and a dining hall for communal meals, or for people to make meals if they didn't have a kitchen of their own. They had a prayer space and a school and a library and a Jewish burial ground, as well as the main congregation. So the synagogue, because it's relatively isolated from other Jewish centers, the synagogue had to be everything to these people. This becomes sort of a model for how synagogues had to be sort of in Western, like in the wild, wild West. Synagogues had to provide everything for people, and it's really quite fascinating. And interestingly enough, we have the harmony of Judaism and Chinese culture, but we also have a harmony of Judaism and Chinese culture through the medium of Islam, because it is through Muslim traders that the Jews of Kaifeng got their Torah scrolls. That's how they got their books and their materials. They purchased them through Muslim traders. So because of their extensive cooperation with Muslims, they actually absorbed some Islamic terms and words. For example, instead of rabbi, they appear to have used the word mullah, which is a Muslim term for a teacher. So this is an incredible example of Chinese, Muslim, and Jewish cooperation in one place. And it's an extraordinary example of this kind of diversity that I've been talking about. And it really comes down to minhag, the customs of the elders. Minhag refers to essentially not only the customs of the elders, but how we live, how we've learned to live. The accepted ways of doing things. You know, rabbis have grandmas too, and it's not just all about book learning when you're a rabbi. You also absorb Jewish ways of life from your family, and that's where minhag comes in. The way you do things, because that's the way it's always been done. And minhag accounts for the absorption of local contexts. The much of the global diversity that we see is really down to minhag. Context, history, geography, climate, neighbors, languages spoken, and the things that your family did, because Judaism is an intensely domestic religion, and in many ways you learn how to be a Jew from infancy, from your family. So over generations of living in different places, minhag changes. And yes, you have texts, and yes, you have Torah, and that provides a backbone. But in many ways, minhag provides the flexibility, the adaptation, and the beautiful cultural diversity that we're seeing here. If you look at So what does it mean to be culturally different but still be Jewish? Remember when we talked about ethno-religiosity, when it's not enough to just say they're Jews. You also have to specify the ethnicity that goes along with this, because Judaism is a world religion. It's global. And ethno-religiosity, the way peoplehood or the way the ethnos melds with religion, is often expressed in different rituals, different rites. The Ashkenazi rite and the Sephardic rite, particularly, we'll be talking about this term. So the way that you do things, the things that you include, for example, on a Passover Seder plate, the exact way that you fulfill the commandments, the exact way that you fulfill the holidays, the types of treats that you enjoy on holidays, the kind of music you listen to, these things are colored by where you are. And the problem gets in with how we can respect the way other Jews that do things Jewishly, if they're not doing it the same way as we do it Jewishly. And this has been a struggle within Judaism. For example, specifically, during Passover, Jews are forbidden to eat leaven. That means it's unkosher for Passover. Ashkenazis say that you can't eat rice and legumes because it may be contaminated with leaven. Sephardim are fine eating rice and rice and legumes for Passover. So in many families, it comes down to, I can't eat with that side of the family if they're eating things that I disagree with. So religion and theology and differences over practices can have really pragmatic challenges when it comes to Jews coming together over these things. We'll talk more about these things as we move on, but I'm going to try to wrap this up. So the question that kind of runs through this is, who is a Jew? Well, you don't have to look a certain way to be a Jew, obviously. You don't have to necessarily dress a specific way to be a Jew. Being a Jew is, the definition of who is a Jew has even changed over time. Now, many of you will say, well, to be born of a Jewish mother or convert, that's the rabbinic definition of who a Jew is. Someone who is who has clear matrilineal descent, or who has been officially converted to Judaism by an appropriate rabbinic authority. So if you convert by an authority that isn't recognized, there will be Jews who refute your conversion. But this isn't the only way Jews have been defined. During the temple period, Jews were defined as those who had access to the temple. The temple itself had a lot of control over who was a Jew or who wasn't. And then, of course, after the loss of the temple, synagogues, communities had to become a little bit more judicious on this. And after the Babylonian exile, the definition of who is a Jew shifted to the matrilineal side to prevent Jewish men from marrying non-Jewish women. And as my dad used to say, everyone knows who their mother is, but it takes a smart man to know who their father is. Things happen, and so it's a pragmatic issue to define lineage through the mother and not the father, because generally speaking, it's easier to tell who your mother is historically, not to be too indelicate there. But also, it's also a matter of being raised. If you're raised by a Jewish mother, you are more likely to embrace Judaism than perhaps if your father is the only Jew in the household. For Karaite Jews and other non-Talmudic Jews and pre-Talmudic Jews, patrilineal descent also counts. So that is a way that the definition has changed. As long as you're raised Jewish, for most non-Talmudic Jews, then you are Jewish, whether it's your mother or your father that you have descent from. Now, we will get into the idea of post-Talmudic, but many Reform congregations also recognize patrilineal descent, particularly if a child has been raised as Jewish, if only their father is Jewish. In many Reformed congregations, they're still recognized as Jewish themselves. So right down to who is a Jew is one of those questions that not all Jews agree on. And it gets more complex every day. But there's your nice, tidy rabbinic definition. Okay, and I'm running out of time, so we'll leave this for another session. But it's also good to recognize that women's Judaism is another form of diversity throughout all of this. Oftentimes, when we talk about Judaism, when we talk about Jews, we imply maleness, and this is not the only way to consider it. Female Jews, women Jews are not simply the mothers of Jews and the wives of Jews. They are Jews themselves. And that sometimes gets divided or gets forgotten. I'm not just the mother of a Jew. I am a Jew. And that's something that history has sort of had trouble recognizing. A lot of the documents that we have were written by men from male perspective. And we often default to male perspective. So we'll look more at this in future classes as much as we can, because often women's Judaism has been under-recorded, and we need to spend some time actually specifically looking at what Judaism has meant for women during this time period. We don't have much at all, by the way, of antiquity. So we didn't really talk a lot about women in Judaism in antiquity because we really don't have much record. Okay, so remember, normative Judaism needs to give way to diverse Judaisms, even in this period and throughout this course in general. Okay, so your post for this week is to differentiate between Rabbinic Judaism and Judaism as a whole, define Rabbinic Judaism, and explain why we need the term Rabbinic Judaism and why we can't just simply refer to it as Judaism. I've kind of given you the answer there, but I want to see you acknowledge this and put it into words so that we can be crystal clear on this matter. So the test is done. The first unit test is done. Your first unit paper is due tomorrow, October 8th. The full instructions are on my learning space. But that's your task for the first unit paper, is to discuss the temple and its meanings throughout Unit 1. Not just religious meanings, it also had practical, political, economic, social meanings as well. So try to show as much depth of understanding as you can within a very short amount of time, and treat this as if it were an essay question on a test, only with citations and a works cited. If you have any last minute questions, email me. It's due tomorrow at 5 p.m., so at the close of business tomorrow, not at midnight. Most things are due at midnight, but since I won't be near a computer after 5 tomorrow, I can't help you if something goes wrong, so it's due at 5, okay? So your final papers are also, they're a while away. They're not due until December 15th, but over reading week, I do encourage you to look at the instructions that are on my learning space and start thinking about what topic you might want to do, because there are multiple topic categories for you to pick from. So over reading week or today, go read them and start thinking in the back of your head which one of those topics you might want to do for the final paper that's due on December 15th. We don't have a final exam in this class, so make your final paper an excellent one, okay? If you have any comments, questions, or concerns, please email me at any time. I'll get to you as soon as I can, although I will be taking the long weekend off to rest, hopefully perk up a little bit for after reading week, okay? So take care, have a great reading week, and I will see you back here on the 19th. Bye for now.